February 10, 1945. Over the Batan Islands, north of Luzon, a single American fighter patrol was coming to an end. First Lieutenant Lewis Curtis was flying a P-51 Mustang, named Bad Angel at low altitude, scanning the coastline for Japanese movement. The area below him was enemy-controlled. The war in the Pacific had entered its final phase, and mistakes were no longer survivable. Curtis looked down and saw an American C-47 transport descending toward a short runway carved into the island. The aircraft's landing gear was already down. Its approach was steady. Its crew believed they were safe. They were not. The airstrip belonged to the Japanese. Curtis knew it immediately. He had seen similar strips before. He had learned, through captivity earlier in the war, what happened to Allied personnel who landed intact behind enemy lines. Capture here did not mean detention. It meant interrogation, starvation, and execution. Curtis attempted contact. The radio produced nothing. The transport's crew could not hear him. He banked hard and flew alongside the C-47, rocking his wings in a clear visual command to turn away. There was no response. The transport continued its descent. Time collapsed. The aircraft was seconds from committing itself to the runway. Curtis had no authority to intervene. He had no orders covering this situation. He had no confirmation of who was aboard. He did the remaining calculation in silence. If the C-47 landed, everyone inside would be taken alive by Japanese troops already moving toward the field. There would be no rescue. If he fired, the aircraft might crash. People might die, but there was a chance they would live. Curtis rolled in behind the transport. He aligned his guns. He selected a firing solution that avoided the cockpit. At that moment, unknown to him, one of the passengers aboard the aircraft was a U.S. Army nurse named Svetlana Valeria. 2 nights earlier, she had shared dinner with Curtis. He had intended to see her again. Curtis squeezed the trigger. The decision was final. At that moment, the situation was not chaotic. It was precise. The airspace was quiet. The enemy was not yet reacting. Militarily, Curtis was not improvising under fire. He was evaluating a narrow window of possibility. The C-47 was flying low, slow, and committed. With its landing gear down, it had sacrificed speed for stability. That made it vulnerable, but also controllable. The aircraft was not maneuvering. It was not evasive. It was following a straight glide path toward the strip. That mattered. Curtis knew the aircraft type well. The C-47 was durable. It was designed to absorb damage and stay controllable. It had 2 engines spaced far enough apart that a single engine failure did not guarantee loss of the aircraft. Even the loss of both engines did not automatically mean destruction if altitude, airspeed, and sea state were favorable. The geography mattered. The airstrip sat close to the coast. The surrounding water was relatively calm. A controlled ditching was possible. That option disappeared the moment the wheels touched the runway. Once on the ground, the aircraft would be intact, immobile, and surrounded. Japanese anti-aircraft fire had already begun to range upward. That confirmed Curtis's assessment. The strip was active. Troops were present. The transport was seconds from irreversible capture. From a purely military standpoint, Curtis had 3 theoretical options. He could do nothing and preserve his own record. He could continue signaling and hope for recognition that would never come. Or he could force the aircraft down under conditions he could influence. The third option was the only one that preserved any chance of survival for the people inside. The opportunity lay in control. Curtis did not need to destroy the aircraft. He needed to deny it the runway. That required disabling thrust, not airframe integrity. The Mustang's .50 caliber guns gave him that capability. Short, deliberate bursts aimed at the engines could remove power without tearing the fuselage apart. The timing was critical. Too early, and the transport might attempt to turn back toward the island, still within Japanese reach. Too late, and it would already be committed to landing. Curtis waited until the aircraft was low enough that ditching was unavoidable, but high enough that the descent could be managed. He also understood the odds. A controlled water landing carried risk, but it was a known risk. Crews trained for it. Survival rates were acceptable, especially compared to capture. Japanese forces had demonstrated repeatedly that Allied aircrew taken alive in the Philippines were unlikely to survive the week. Curtis had learned that lesson personally. He did not need intelligence briefings or policy guidance. He was operating from experience. The opportunity, then, was not heroic. It was technical. The transport was slow. The sea was close. The fighter had the firepower to shape the outcome without annihilation. The enemy had not yet closed the distance. What made the moment unique was not that Curtis acted. It was that the conditions allowed his action to matter. Within seconds, the window would close. Either the C-47 would land intact and be lost, or it would be forced down on terms dictated by an American pilot who understood exactly what he was risking. That opportunity existed only once, and Curtis recognized it. Curtis was not acting on impulse. The judgment he made in those seconds had been forming for years. He had learned it the hard way, not in training, but in captivity. Earlier in the war, after being shot down over Europe, Curtis had spent time as a prisoner. He had seen what awaited airmen once the protections of uniform and convention collapsed. Survival was no longer a matter of rank or regulations. It was a matter of how quickly fate closed in. That experience shaped how he evaluated risk. Capture was not a neutral outcome. It was not a pause in the war. It was an endpoint. By 1945, Curtis had accumulated enough combat hours to understand aircraft behavior intuitively. He did not need calculations. He knew how much punishment a transport could take and still stay controllable. He knew how a ditching looked when it worked and how it looked when it failed. He knew where to aim if he wanted engines disabled rather than fuel tanks ruptured or control surfaces shredded. He also understood his own limits. He was alone. He had no wingmen to cover him. He had limited ammunition. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was increasing with every second the transport descended. If he lingered too long, he risked losing his own aircraft and adding another American to the list of captives. Curtis prepared himself by narrowing the problem. He was not deciding whether to save everyone. He was deciding whether to preserve any chance at all. He aligned his aircraft carefully. He avoided the cockpit. He avoided the wings. He aimed where power lived and where redundancy could be stripped away without immediate structural failure. This was not aggression. It was restraint. Even then, Curtis delayed. He made one final pass alongside the transport. He rocked his wings again, sharper this time. He cut across its nose, close enough that the C-47's crew could not miss him. The message was unmistakable. There was still no response. At that point, Curtis accepted that the crew inside the transport did not understand their situation. That mattered. If they believed they were safe, they would not take evasive action. If they believed he was hostile, they might panic. Either outcome removed control from his hands. Control was the one thing he still had. He adjusted his approach to minimize shock. He positioned himself slightly below and behind the right engine, offset to avoid debris. He selected short bursts rather than continuous fire. He committed to disabling thrust without escalating destruction. Curtis also accepted the personal cost. If the transport crashed and people died, responsibility would belong to him alone. There would be no shared blame, no operational justification, no paper trail explaining why he had fired on an American aircraft. He understood how this would look to anyone reviewing it later, without context, without the sound of Japanese guns rising from the ground. That awareness did not stop him. It clarified the choice. The warning, then, was not verbal. It was procedural. Curtis prepared to act in a way that preserved life by violating expectation. He chose a solution that no manual described, but that experience made unavoidable. When he finally pressed the trigger, it was not anger or desperation that guided him. It was acceptance. Acceptance that the safest place for that transport was not the runway ahead, but the water beside it. Acceptance that saving lives sometimes required becoming the instrument of danger. He did not know who was aboard. He did not know that one of those lives was intimately connected to his own. He did not know how the decision would echo beyond that moment. He only knew what capture meant, and he knew he would not allow it to happen while he still had the means to intervene. The warning had already been issued. The action that followed was simply the last remaining step. The decision Curtis made in the air existed in a vacuum only for seconds. What shaped it, and what constrained it, came from far beyond the cockpit. By early 1945, the Pacific War had hardened into an institutional posture built on momentum, not flexibility. Allied air operations assumed dominance. Navigation errors were treated as anomalies, not warnings. Transport flights followed schedules that prioritized speed over verification. The system expected compliance from the environment. When that expectation failed, There were no procedures for recovery. Curtis was not authorized to interfere with a friendly aircraft. There was no doctrine for disabling an American transport to prevent capture. The chain of command offered no guidance because it had never anticipated such a collision of circumstances. In institutional terms, Curtis was alone. That isolation was not accidental. It was structural. The Pacific Theater operated under decentralized execution, but centralized accountability. Pilots were encouraged to act aggressively against the enemy, but conservatively around friendly assets. Any deviation from that balance risked disciplinary action after the fact, regardless of intent. The system rewarded results that aligned with expectation and punished those that forced uncomfortable explanations. Curtis knew this. He also knew that if the transport landed intact, responsibility would dissolve upward. It would be a navigation error, a miscommunication, an unfortunate outcome of war. No single individual would carry the burden. If he fired, the opposite would occur. The act would be traceable. A named pilot, a recorded engagement, a clear violation of norms. The institutional reflex would not be to ask why he acted, but why he disobeyed. That imbalance mattered. There was also the political context of capture. By 1945, Allied command was increasingly sensitive to the optics of prisoners taken by Japan. Reports of atrocities were widespread but officially understated. Acknowledging that capture equaled likely death created pressure to adjust policy, alter risk thresholds, and explain losses that could no longer be categorized as unfortunate but survivable. It was easier, administratively, to treat capture as an abstract possibility rather than a guaranteed consequence. That abstraction protected senior command from having to answer why aircrews were routed over hostile territory without fail-safes. Curtis's decision threatened that abstraction. If his action became precedent, it would imply that existing procedures were insufficient. It would suggest that airmen might be expected to destroy friendly assets to compensate for planning failures. Institutions resist implications that assign them responsibility. There was also the human factor embedded in hierarchy. Curtis was a junior officer. The crew of the C-47 included senior personnel and non-combatants. Nurses were symbols, not combatants. The idea that a fighter pilot might fire on a transport carrying medical staff cut directly against the narrative the war depended on. That narrative mattered. It sustained morale. It justified sacrifice. It preserved the illusion that systems protected those who served within them. Curtis was not defending that narrative. He was operating beneath it. The overruling force, then, was not a general's order or a political directive issued in real time. It was the accumulated weight of assumptions that said this situation should not exist and therefore required no guidance. When it did exist, the system offered silence. That silence functioned as an implicit veto on action, not because action was forbidden, but because it was unthinkable. Curtis understood that by acting, he would step outside the space where institutional protection applied. Yet the same system that discouraged his intervention had placed the transport on that flight path. It had allowed a radio failure to go uncorrected. It had routed personnel over enemy-held territory under the assumption that air superiority equaled safety. Those decisions were made far from the cockpit, in offices where outcomes were measured statistically, not personally. Curtis absorbed the consequences of those decisions in real time. He could not escalate. He could not consult. He could not defer. The overruling force, in the end, was not command telling him to stand down. It was command's absence, a void created by policy that assumed perfection and offered no answer when it failed. Curtis acted within that void. He did so knowing that if the people inside the transport survived, the system might quietly accept the result while distancing itself from the method. If they died, the system would close ranks, isolate the act, and assign blame downward. That calculus was clear to him. It did not change the outcome. The institutional framework had already failed the moment the aircraft descended toward that runway. Curtis's choice did not create the crisis. It exposed it. What followed in the air was not a clash of wills between individuals. It was the collision between a rigid structure and a reality it had not prepared for. Curtis did not overrule the system. He acted where the system had left nothing to rule at all. The first burst struck the right engine. Power collapsed instantly. Smoke trailed back along the wing. The transport lurched, but did not break apart. Curtis held his fire and observed. The aircraft was still flying. still descending, still pointed at the runway. The second burst took the left engine. That ended any remaining possibility of a landing. The C-47 lost thrust symmetrically, which mattered. It did not yaw violently. It did not roll. It settled. The pilot inside did what transport pilots were trained to do when options disappeared. He aimed for the water. The ditching occurred just offshore, short of the runway, and outside the immediate reach of Japanese troops. The fuselage struck the sea hard but intact. The wings held long enough for the aircraft to stay afloat. The crew and passengers evacuated quickly. 13 people reached the rafts. Curtis circled overhead. Japanese soldiers were already moving toward the shoreline. Small arms fire reached up from the beach. Curtis used what ammunition he had left to suppress movement near the waterline. He did not strafe indiscriminately. He fired to delay, not to destroy. Fuel became the limiting factor. When his gauges dropped, Curtis disengaged. He left the scene knowing only that the aircraft had not reached the runway and that at least some people had escaped it alive. That was the immediate consequence. The larger one unfolded slowly. Japanese forces reached the crash site after Curtis departed. They did not find intact prisoners. They found wreckage and empty rafts drifting away from shore. The tide worked against them. By the time patrol boats were launched, the Americans were already beyond effective reach. The following morning, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina located the survivors and pulled them from the water. All 13 were recovered alive. Curtis learned none of this in the air. He returned to base alone, carrying the weight of an action that had no precedent and no immediate validation. He was summoned shortly after landing. The expectation was punishment. Friendly fire, regardless of intent, was not a theoretical offense. It was a career-ending one. There were no commendations for shooting American aircraft out of the sky. There were courts-martial. Instead, Curtis was taken into a room and handed a document. It was the passenger manifest. He read the names mechanically at first. Crew, support personnel, medical staff. Then one name separated itself from the list. Svetlana Valeria. Curtis stopped reading. Only then did the full scope of the decision register. Not as an abstract moral calculus, but as a personal collision. The person he had seen alive days earlier, the person he had spoken to casually, the person whose future he had assumed would unfold separately from his own decisions, had been inside the aircraft he fired upon. No one in the room offered commentary. There was nothing to add. Curtis confirmed that he had not known who was aboard. The question was asked because it had to be. The answer mattered less than the outcome. The outcome was survival. The institutional response followed a familiar pattern. The act itself was not celebrated publicly. It did not fit comfortably within existing narratives. There were no press releases explaining why an American fighter had shot down an American transport. The story remained contained. Curtis received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation was careful. It spoke of preventing capture. It avoided detail. It did not describe the method. It framed the result without dwelling on the means. That framing served a purpose. It allowed the system to acknowledge success without endorsing precedent. Curtis's aircraft later carried an unusual marking. Alongside the flags denoting enemy aircraft he had destroyed appeared a small American flag. It was not a boast. It was an accounting, a record that refused simplification. The personal consequences arrived later, away from command rooms and citations. Curtis visited Svetlana after the rescue. The meeting was brief. It did not unfold like a reunion framed by gratitude alone. She struck him first. The gesture was not symbolic. It was immediate and unfiltered. It acknowledged the violence of what he had done. Then she kissed him. The sequence mattered. The order mattered. It captured the reality the paperwork never would. Curtis had endangered her life to save it. Both truths coexisted. In the months that followed, the war moved on. The Pacific Campaign continued. Larger decisions eclipsed smaller ones. Curtis's action did not alter strategy. It did not influence doctrine. It did not become a case study taught to future pilots. Its consequences were confined to the lives it preserved and the quiet adjustments made to accommodate an outcome no one wanted to analyze too closely. Curtis and Svetlana married after the war. The decision that joined their lives had already been made in the air, without ceremony or consent. The marriage simply acknowledged what survival had made possible. The transport, the runway, the Japanese garrison, the brief window in which one pilot imposed his judgment on events moving too fast for orders, all of it receded into history. What remained was the consequence that could not be undone. 13 people lived because an American pilot chose to violate expectation rather than obey silence. That result stood on its own. No further justification was required. The battlefield did not mark the moment as heroic. It registered it as disruption. The system recorded it as anomaly. The individuals involved carried it as fact. The decision had been made in seconds. The consequences lasted decades. They always do. The record that followed was assembled slowly, without urgency, and without appetite for scrutiny. Curtis's action never entered official doctrine. It was not circulated as guidance. It was not analyzed in training syllabi. In post-war summaries of air operations in the Philippines, the incident appeared, if at all, as a footnote stripped of context. A transport was lost. Personnel survived. The cause was categorized as extraordinary. That classification mattered. Extraordinary events require no correction. They exist outside pattern, and therefore outside responsibility. Curtis's citation reflected that approach. The language emphasized outcome, not mechanism. It praised initiative while avoiding specificity. There was no mention of friendly fire. No acknowledgement that the survival of the passengers depended on the deliberate disabling of their aircraft by an American pilot. The record preserved the result and obscured the process. That was consistent with how the war documented itself near the end. As victory approached, the machinery of record-keeping shifted from explanation to closure. Ambiguity was tolerated if it simplified the narrative. Curtis himself did not contest this. He did not publish memoirs arguing his case. He did not seek interviews. He did not frame the incident as moral dilemma or romantic tragedy. When asked later, he described it plainly. The aircraft was going to land. Capture meant death. He acted. That restraint made the story easier to contain. Post-war historians who encountered the incident often treated it as anomaly rather than evidence. It did not align cleanly with the prevailing emphasis on command decisions, large formations, or strategic outcomes. It was a single pilot making an irreversible choice with incomplete information. That scale resisted integration. Even the personal dimension remained largely private. Curtis and Svetlana did not build a public identity around the event. Their marriage did not become a symbol. It became a life. They lived with the knowledge of what had happened without revisiting it publicly. In later years, when archives opened and fragments of the story resurfaced, the emphasis shifted again. The incident was recast as an example of individual judgment under extreme constraint. But even then, analysis stopped short of institutional implication. No inquiry asked why a transport carrying medical personnel flew without reliable navigation safeguards over enemy territory. No review addressed why protocols offered no method for aborting such a landing from the air. The questions remained implicit, unpursued. That omission was not oversight. It was function. The war's final accounting favored decisions made at desks, not those forced in seconds. It favored clarity of authority, not ambiguity of responsibility. Curtis's action belonged to a category the system preferred to leave undefined. By the time the event entered public awareness decades later, it had already been shaped by silence. The lack of controversy was taken as validation. The absence of punishment was interpreted as approval. The absence of policy change was ignored. Curtis's death in 1995 closed the last direct link to the decision itself. What remained were documents that spoke carefully and memories that did not seek amplification. The post-war record, taken as a whole, does not argue whether Curtis was right or wrong. It does something more revealing. It treats the incident as resolved. The people lived. The war ended. The system moved on. No corrective action was required because the outcome did not demand it. That is the final form such decisions take when they succeed. They are absorbed, neutralized, and filed away as exceptions. Curtis did not challenge that process. He did not need to. The record stands as it was allowed to stand. Incomplete. Sanitized. Adequate for closure. And in that sense, it achieved exactly what the system required. The case was closed. The decision did not belong to history's margins. It belonged to a single moment when authority failed to arrive in time. Lewis Curtis was not following doctrine. There was none. He was not executing an order. No one had given one. He acted because the system that placed 13 Americans on a descent path toward captivity had no mechanism to stop itself. That is the record. The aircraft did not reach the runway. The passengers were not captured. The war did not pause to acknowledge how close it came to a different outcome. It rarely does. Curtis was decorated, but quietly. The citation praised result and avoided method. The institution accepted the outcome without absorbing the implication. It was enough that the problem disappeared. That was the final judgment rendered by the system. Survival validated the act. Silence contained it. The personal cost was carried privately. Curtis lived with the knowledge that his decision could not be explained away by procedure or shared responsibility. It rested entirely on him. The fact that one of the lives he saved was the woman he later married did not simplify the act. It complicated it permanently. There was no lesson extracted, no policy rewritten, no manual amended to prepare for the next time perfection failed. That omission is the verdict. War rewards outcomes, not processes. When a decision works, the machinery moves on. When it does not, blame travels downward. Curtis's decision succeeded. Therefore, it required no further examination. The case closes there. A single pilot destroyed an American aircraft to save the Americans inside it. The institution accepted the survival and discarded the question of why the choice had been necessary at all. Nothing more was asked. That is how the war recorded it. That is how it remains. If you want more closed cases like this, decisions made in silence and paid for in full by those who carried them, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. The outcome is known. The cost was already paid.